One line in the dispatch log changed the case. The case would later be defined by a single sentence typed during a quiet overnight shift. At the time, it looked like nothing more than routine documentation from a call that felt ordinary. The call came in just after 12:30 in the morning, when the county usually went silent. Maribel Crane had been a dispatcher for nearly 13 years, and she trusted patterns more than instincts. Most serious emergencies announce themselves clearly, with panic, noise, and urgency spilling through the line. This call did not. The man who called sounded winded but controlled, like someone trying to sound calm on purpose. He said he was driving home when his headlights caught a pickup truck down in a roadside ditch. The vehicle sat nose forward at an odd angle, with no lights on and no movement inside. Maribel asked for his location, and he hesitated before answering. He gave a mile marker, then corrected himself, then mentioned a service road nearby. She typed carefully, noting the changes without commenting on them. He said he walked up to the truck and looked through the driver's window. There was blood on the steering wheel, dark and dried in places. The driver was slumped forward, seatbelt on, and not responding. Maribel asked if he had checked for breathing. The man said no, he did not want to touch anything. His voice tightened slightly when he said it, then smoothed out again. She dispatched a patrol unit and volunteer medics, classifying the call as a single vehicle accident. As she worked through the checklist, she kept listening to the background noise on the line. There was wind, distant traffic, and nothing else. Just before hanging up, the man added something she had not asked about. He said the crash must have happened hours earlier because nobody else was around. Maribel paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She asked him why he thought the crash was old. The man hesitated, then said the truck just looked like it had been there a while. That answer felt thin, but not thin enough to challenge. Maribel asked one more question, keeping her tone neutral. She asked if the engine felt cold. The man said no, the engine was warm. There was a brief silence after that, the kind that lingered longer than expected. Maribel typed as he spoke, documenting the contradiction without comment. Caller reports engine warm despite belief crash occurred hours earlier. She closed the call and moved on, already answering another line. In her experience, small inconsistencies were common and usually meaningless. 11 minutes later, Deputy Alric Boone arrived at the scene. He was nearing the end of a long shift and hoped for a quick resolution. What he saw matched the report closely enough to satisfy him. The driver was identified as Roland Ives, age 46, a local mechanic. He was slumped forward in the seat with a visible head wound near his hairline. There were no skid marks, no broken signs, and no debris scattered across the road. The medic confirmed death at the scene, estimating it had occurred sometime earlier. With no obvious signs of foul play, the incident was logged as non-suspicious. The truck was towed, photos were taken, and traffic flowed again. By sunrise, the case was already settling into paperwork. It looked like another lonely death on a forgotten stretch of road. No witnesses, no clear cause, and no reason to look twice. Maribel returned for her next shift that night and barely remembered the call. The dispatch log remained unchanged, one line sitting quietly among dozens of others. 2 days later, that line would be read again, and nothing would be routine after that. 2 days after the crash, the file reached an investigator who did not trust summaries. Halden Pierce was 51, methodical, and known for rereading what others skimmed once. He believed most mistakes lived in margins, timestamps, and sentences people assumed were harmless. He read the report front to back, then opened the dispatch log. That was where he stopped. The line about the warm engine did not fit the timeline at all. If the crash happened hours earlier, the engine should have been cold. If the engine was warm, then the crash was recent or the truck was run afterward. Either option meant the initial conclusion was wrong. Halden requested the tow yard intake notes before doing anything else. The operator had written that the hood felt warm when he hooked the truck. He also noted the radio was playing a local station that signed off overnight. That detail mattered. The station stopped broadcasting just after midnight. If the radio was still on, the truck had been running not long before discovery. Halden pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest working intersection. It was miles away, grainy, and rarely useful, but he checked anyway. He found a pickup matching the truck passing through 20 minutes before the call. That erased the idea of a crash sitting unnoticed for hours. Someone had either been mistaken or someone had lied. Halden reclassified the case and requested the original caller information. The name was Keaton Rule, age 32, a local delivery driver. His record included minor theft and a previous false report years earlier. Halden brought Keaton in for a follow-up interview. Keaton appeared cooperative, but his answers drifted under pressure. He repeated the story, then adjusted small details without noticing. He said he was driving home, then later said he was heading out. He said the truck looked abandoned, then said he could see fresh blood. When asked about the engine, he avoided eye contact. Halden asked him directly why he believed the crash was old. Keaton said it was just a feeling, nothing specific. That answer did not survive silence. Phone records placed Keaton near the area earlier that night. They also showed his emergency call came from several miles away. That explained why nobody saw him at the scene. While Halden waited on more records, the autopsy report arrived. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma inconsistent with a steering wheel impact. The wound suggested a heavy object, delivered with force from close range. Halden visited Roland Ives's garage the same afternoon. The place was orderly, with tools aligned and labeled. One space on the wall was empty, the outline of a tire iron visible in dust. Oil stains on the floor showed a recent vehicle movement. The pattern suggested the truck had been driven after an abrupt stop. It looked less like an accident and more like cleanup. Halden brought Keaton back in for a second interview. This time, the tone changed. Halden laid out the timeline slowly, one piece at a time. The warm engine, the radio station, the camera footage, the missing tool. Keaton listened, nodding, breathing shallow, saying nothing. When Halden finished, he slid the dispatch log across the table. He pointed to the single line typed by a dispatcher he had never met. Halden asked Keaton if the engine was warm because he had just shut it off. Keaton swallowed hard and stared at the table. He did not answer. The room stayed quiet longer than most people could tolerate. When Keaton finally looked up, his face had changed, and Halden knew the case was about to break open. Keaton broke the silence by asking for water, then pushed the cup away without drinking. His shoulders slumped, as if he had been holding himself upright by force alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and steadier than Halden expected. He said he knew Roland and that they had known each other for years. They had worked together briefly at a repair shop before money ruined the friendship. Roland had accused him of stealing tools, and the argument never fully died. On the night of the crash, Keaton went to Roland's garage to confront him. He claimed he only wanted to talk, but the discussion turned heated quickly. Words turned into shouting, and shouting turned into something neither planned. Keaton said Roland grabbed a tire iron from the wall, not to swing it, but to threaten him. Keaton reacted without thinking, striking first and harder than he realized. Roland fell backward, hit his head, and did not get back up. Keaton said he panicked when he realized Roland was not moving. He checked for breathing, found none, and felt the weight of what he had done. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision he thought would save him. He dragged Roland into the truck, buckled him in, and wiped down the garage floor. He drove the truck out to the highway, choosing a spot he thought looked accidental. He eased it into the ditch, careful not to leave skid marks. He left the engine running longer than intended, then shut it off and walked away. After driving several miles, he called emergency services and pretended to discover the crash. He believed distance would erase connection and time would erase doubt. What he did not consider was habit. He did not consider a dispatcher trained to document contradictions without judgment. He did not consider how machines recorded things people forgot. The confession aligned cleanly with the evidence already gathered. Phone records, camera footage, tool placement, and injury patterns matched his account. The case moved quickly once the story stopped changing. Keaton was charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. He accepted a plea agreement months later, avoiding trial and a longer sentence. The final paperwork was sealed, and the case faded from public attention. Maribel Crane learned about the outcome through an internal bulletin. Her name was not mentioned, and her note was not highlighted. To her, it was just another closed call from years earlier. She continued working nights, answering phones, and typing details others overlooked. She never asked what happened to the cases that passed through her hands. She only believed that accuracy mattered even when nobody seemed to notice. Halden Pierce retired several years later. When asked about cases that stayed with him, he mentioned this one quietly. He said the truth often hides inside sentences people rush past. The crash was never what it appeared to be. It was not solved by a dramatic discovery or a single bold move. It was solved because one line did not match the story it belonged to. Long after the files were archived, that line remained unchanged. A simple observation typed during a quiet shift. One line in the dispatch log that changed the case. A motel room that never showed up on records. A motel room became the source of quiet confusion years after a single overnight shift revealed a problem nobody could later document. For one night, the room functioned normally, then slowly disappeared from official existence. Calvin Rohn was 39 years old and worked the overnight desk at a roadside motel along a secondary highway. The building dated back to the late 1970s and mostly served truck drivers and travelers arriving after midnight. Calvin preferred night shifts because routines stayed predictable, and predictable routines made irregularities easier to notice. On a cold winter night in 2011, Calvin began his shift just before midnight and reviewed the occupancy board behind the front desk. Only 6 rooms were occupied, leaving the ground floor mostly empty and unusually quiet. Outside, passing traffic was light and the parking lot sat still under yellow security lights. At around 1:30 in the morning, a man entered the lobby wearing a dark jacket and carrying a small duffel bag. He looked tired but alert and asked for a quiet room away from traffic noise. He added that he planned to leave early and did not need a wake-up call. Calvin processed the payment in cash and slid a registration card across the counter. He chose room 17 at the far end of the ground floor, a room rarely requested because of its distance from the lobby. The guest signed, took the key envelope, thanked Calvin briefly, and walked toward the exterior corridor without hesitation. Calvin marked room 17 as occupied in his handwritten backup ledger. He kept the ledger in case the aging computer system froze during overnight audits. He watched the guest disappear around the corner through the lobby window, then returned to his routine checks and paperwork. The next 90 minutes passed quietly. No new guests arrived, and the lobby stayed silent except for the hum of the vending machine. Calvin completed his audit entries and checked the security monitor, which showed empty walkways and motionless parked vehicles. Just after 3 in the morning, the desk phone rang. The display showed an internal extension rather than an outside line. Calvin answered and heard a calm male voice asking for extra towels. The caller said he was staying in room 17 and mentioned that the heater rattled loudly whenever it turned on. Calvin apologized and said he would bring towels after finishing a short report entry. The caller thanked him and hung up without further comment. Calvin wrote a brief note about the heater complaint on a maintenance slip. Heater issues were common in winter, especially in older rooms near the utility areas. Nothing about the call seemed unusual, yet the room number stayed clear in his mind. He gathered 2 towels from the supply cabinet and stepped outside into the cold hallway. The overhead lights hummed softly as he walked toward the far end of the building. His footsteps echoed slightly, and the hallway felt longer than usual during the quiet hour. When he reached the last door, the light above it flickered once before steadying. Calvin knocked and announced himself. No one answered, but he heard movement inside, like footsteps crossing the floor, then stopping. Calvin waited a moment, listening for a response or the heater noise mentioned earlier. Hearing nothing, he placed the towels neatly on the small table near the door. He turned and walked back toward the lobby, assuming the guest would collect them shortly. He did not receive any further calls from room 17 for the rest of the night. The quiet returned, and Calvin finished his shift, believing the situation was ordinary. At the time, nothing suggested that room 17 would later refuse to exist on paper. The night ended without incident, yet the details of that shift stayed clear in Calvin's memory. The cash payment, the phone call, and the movement behind the door formed a routine pattern. It was only later that the routine would begin to unravel. Morning came quietly, and Calvin began preparing checkout paperwork as pale light crept through the lobby windows. He noticed room 17 still marked as occupied in the ledger and hesitated before continuing his routine. Around 6, Calvin walked the ground floor hallway to check for early departures before housekeeping arrived. When he reached the far end, the door to the room remained closed, and the key was still in the lock. He knocked twice and announced himself, but no sound came from inside. Calvin waited several seconds, listening for movement or the heater noise mentioned during the call. The hallway stayed silent, and the air near that door felt cooler than elsewhere. He returned to the desk and noted the lack of response, assuming the guest left early. Housekeeping arrived shortly after 7 and began their usual rounds. Within minutes, one attendant returned to the lobby and said the last room on the ground floor was already empty. Calvin asked for clarification, and the attendant said there were no personal items anywhere. The bed appeared untouched, the bathroom dry, and the trash bin empty. The towels Calvin delivered earlier were folded neatly on the small table near the door. The heater was cold, and nothing suggested a guest had stayed there overnight. Calvin felt a brief wave of unease, but dismissed it as an unusual checkout. Some guests stayed only a few hours, especially those driving long distances overnight. He handed the key to housekeeping and continued closing out his shift paperwork. Later that morning, the manager reviewed the cash drawer and noticed a discrepancy. The payment Calvin remembered accepting for room 17 did not appear in the tally. Calvin opened his ledger and pointed to the entry, which was written clearly in his handwriting. They checked the computer system together, and no rental record appeared for that room during the night. The manager suggested the payment might have been logged under another room number or returned by mistake. With no receipt and no guest, the books were adjusted and balanced. Calvin mentioned the phone call and the heater complaint, but without a system record, it sounded like memory alone. The manager suggested fatigue might have caused confusion and advised Calvin to get rest before his next shift. The issue was closed as a clerical error. Calvin left the motel that morning feeling unsettled, but unsure how to press the matter further. Nothing concrete supported his recollection beyond the ledger entry and his memory of the call. Over time, the night faded into the background of many uneventful shifts. Years passed, and the motel continued operating with small changes in staff and procedures. Calvin stayed on the overnight desk and noticed that the far-end room was never assigned again. Housekeeping no longer referenced it, and maintenance stopped logging issues there. In 2019, the property prepared for sale and underwent a full audit of records and facilities. External auditors reviewed blueprints, occupancy logs, and maintenance files going back decades. Calvin assisted when asked, answering questions about overnight procedures. During one review session, an auditor asked about the numbering of ground floor rooms. The official list showed rooms 1 through 16, with no room 17 included. Calvin said there had always been a room 17 at the far end of the hallway. The auditor showed him original construction blueprints, which labeled that space as a utility access and sealed storage area. Calvin insisted he had checked guests into that room during his early years at the motel. The auditor noted the statement and requested further verification. Maintenance records confirmed the door existed but categorized it as non-guest access. The lock matched guest room hardware, though its serial number did not appear in the official registry. There were no housekeeping logs, maintenance tickets, or occupancy records tied to the space. Calvin walked the auditor down the hallway and pointed to the door. The number plate was gone, but a faint outline of adhesive remained on the surface. The wall paint around the door looked newer, as if it had been updated separately from the rest. Archived phone logs were reviewed next. They showed an internal call at 3:12 in the morning on the exact date Calvin remembered. The call originated from an extension associated with the utility area behind that wall. A retired maintenance supervisor was later contacted and said the space had been temporarily converted during a renovation in the early 2000s. He said it was used briefly during peak seasons and later reverted to storage without full documentation. He could not explain the missing payment. Calvin retrieved his old ledger from storage at home. The page from that night still showed room 17 written clearly. No other pages referenced that room before or after. The auditors photographed the entry and added it to the final report. The conclusion stated that the room existed temporarily but was never formally integrated into the system. The guest likely stayed briefly and left early, and the payment discrepancy remained unresolved. After the sale, the new owners sealed the door permanently. Calvin eventually left the motel and took a job closer to home. Sometimes he passed the building and remembered the night he checked someone into a room that later vanished from records. He never claimed anything beyond what he observed. To him, the story stayed grounded in forgotten paperwork and overlooked renovations. Still, the memory of a phone call from a room that officially never existed stayed with him. It reminded him that some places function briefly as real, even when history later refuses to record them. The audit ended quietly, and the sale moved forward without delay once the final report was submitted. Calvin was not contacted again about Room 17, and no one asked him to clarify his statements further. The issue settled into paperwork, where unresolved details often stayed without consequence. Several weeks after the new owners took control, Calvin noticed changes during his overnight shifts. Maintenance crews worked late evenings, repainting hallways and replacing fixtures that showed their age. One night, he walked past the far end of the ground floor and saw workers removing the door entirely. The opening behind it revealed a shallow space with exposed piping and wiring that matched utility access descriptions from the blueprints. The wall inside looked unfinished compared to the rest of the motel rooms. By morning, the opening was sealed with drywall and painted to match the corridor. The hallway felt shorter after that, and the far wall looked plain and uninterrupted. Guests never walked that far anymore, and no one asked about a missing room. New staff members learned the layout from updated diagrams that ended at Room 16. Calvin stayed on for several months after the sale, training replacement staff and helping transition overnight procedures. None of them knew about Room 17, and Calvin did not volunteer the story unless directly asked. He sensed that without records, the details sounded like a mistake rather than a memory. Before leaving the job, Calvin reviewed his old ledger one final time. The entry for that winter night remained unchanged, with Room 17 written clearly between other routine notes. It stood alone as the only reference to a room that no longer existed anywhere else. He placed the ledger back in storage and accepted that no further answers would come. The auditors had offered the most plausible explanation, even if parts of it felt incomplete. The space had been used, then erased through neglect rather than intent. Years later, Calvin drove past the motel while traveling for work and barely recognized it. New signage covered the entrance, and fresh paint masked the building's age. Nothing on the exterior suggested that an extra room once operated quietly at the far end. He did not think of the experience as mysterious in a dramatic sense. To him, it reflected how systems fail when temporary decisions go undocumented. A room could exist, serve its purpose, and disappear without leaving more than a trace in one person's memory. The phone call stayed with him most clearly. Someone had used that extension, described a heater problem, and thanked him for help. That moment felt real, regardless of what blueprints or databases later claimed. Calvin understood that places changed and records followed rules that reality did not always respect. What mattered was that the interaction happened, even if no official system agreed. The room had been real for one night, then surrendered to correction and paint. In the end, Calvin accepted that some details are lost not through secrecy, but through indifference. The motel moved on. The hallway stayed quiet, and Room 17 remained absent from every list. Only one person remembered walking towels down a corridor that no longer led anywhere. One cabin, one night, and a mistake no one noticed. One small cabin became the center of a quiet mistake that went unnoticed for years by everyone responsible for tracking it. The error happened during a single winter night, then settled into routine without raising concern. Rylan Moore was 41 years old and worked as a seasonal caretaker for a remote lakeside property owned by a regional utility company. The land contained several identical cabins used by inspectors and engineers during maintenance work on nearby power lines. Rylan lived close enough to respond quickly and handled keys, logs, radios, and basic upkeep during colder months. The property stayed mostly empty in winter. Only a few inspections were scheduled each season, and cabin usage depended on weather and access conditions. Rylan relied heavily on habit and handwritten logs, since digital updates were rare and procedures had stayed the same for years. In early winter of 2014, a routine inspection was scheduled to begin the following morning. According to the plan, two inspectors would arrive together at daylight and stay one night. Ryland prepared two cabins, stocked firewood, tested heaters, and updated the occupancy sheet kept in the small office. Late that evening, snow began falling harder than forecast. Wind pushed it sideways across the lot, and visibility dropped quickly. Just before midnight, headlights appeared through the trees, and a single vehicle pulled into the gravel area near the office. A man stepped out wearing a heavy jacket and carrying a small pack. He introduced himself as part of the inspection team and said he arrived early due to worsening road conditions. He asked if a cabin was available for the night. Ryland checked the occupancy sheet and saw no conflicts. Without hesitation, he assigned the man to cabin 3, which sat slightly apart from the others near the tree line. It was quieter during storms and had fewer heater complaints in past seasons. Ryland unlocked the cabin, showed the man the heater switch and radio protocol, and pointed out emergency supplies. The cabin looked normal, clean, and ready for use. Ryland handed over the key and a handheld radio, then returned to the office and logged the check-in time. Snow continued falling through the early hours. The property lights glowed dimly against the white ground, and the forest beyond stayed dark and still. Ryland completed his rounds, checked locks, and monitored the weather radio for updates. Around 2 in the morning, the handheld radio crackled to life. The man in cabin 3 reported that the heater worked but made a loud knocking sound when it cycled. His tone was calm and practical, like someone used to temporary lodging. Ryland replied that the heater was old but safe and said he would note it for maintenance after the inspection period. Heater noise was common in winter, especially during temperature swings. The man acknowledged and ended the transmission. After the call, Ryland wrote a short note in the margin of the log about the heater complaint. He had learned to write things down immediately, since details blurred after long overnight hours. The note sat quietly beside the check-in entry. He stepped outside once more and looked toward cabin 3 from a distance. Snow fell steadily, softening outlines and muting sound. No light showed through the windows, which did not concern him because many inspectors slept early before morning work. Ryland considered walking over to check the heater himself, but decided against it. The path was slick, and the complaint did not sound urgent. He trusted the radio contact and returned to the office, closing the door against the wind. Inside, the office heater clicked on and off, echoing the same mechanical rhythm described by the man earlier. Ryland listened absently while reviewing supply lists and next-day tasks. Nothing felt out of place or required immediate action. Before dawn, Ryland walked the property one final time. Cabin 3 showed no exterior lights and no visible movement inside. Fresh snowfall covered the ground evenly, making footprints impossible to distinguish from drifting patterns. Ryland locked the office as the sky began to lighten behind the trees. He believed the night passed normally, with one early arrival and a minor heater issue logged for later attention. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that assigning cabin 3 would become a problem. Only later would the routine details begin to separate from official records. What seemed like a standard check-in would slowly turn into a mistake that no one noticed until years had passed. Morning arrived slowly as snowfall eased into light flurries drifting across the frozen lake. Ryland woke after a short rest and returned to the office to prepare for the inspection team's arrival. Just after 7, 2 vehicles entered the property and parked near the office. 3 inspectors stepped out together, stamping snow from their boots and greeting Ryland casually. They thanked him for preparing the cabins and said the drive had been rough but manageable. Ryland asked which one arrived early the previous night. The group exchanged brief looks, then one supervisor said no one came ahead of schedule. According to them, all inspectors had stayed at a motel closer to town due to the storm. Ryland felt immediate confusion and said he checked in one inspector just before midnight. He mentioned assigning cabin 3 and receiving a radio call about the heater during the night. The supervisor shook his head and said that did not match their timeline. They reviewed the schedule together inside the office. The printed plan showed all inspectors arriving that morning. No early arrival was noted, and no lodging was authorized for the previous night. Ryland opened the occupancy sheet and pointed to the entry in his handwriting. Cabin 3 showed a clear check-in time from the night before. The supervisor said the name listed belonged to an inspector standing in the room who insisted he arrived only that morning. They walked out together toward cabin 3. Snow lay thick around the cabins, and the path looked undisturbed. When Rylan unlocked the door, the cabin felt cold and unused. The heater was off, the bed neatly made, and the firewood stacked exactly as prepared. The handheld radio Rylan issued the night before sat on the table, powered off. The supervisor said the inspector's radio had remained sealed in its packaging until moments earlier. No one could explain how the radio ended up inside the cabin. Rylan mentioned the heater complaint again, describing the knocking sound reported over the radio. The supervisor said maintenance logs showed no heater issues reported during the inspection period. At the time, the discrepancy was treated as confusion rather than evidence. With work scheduled and daylight limited, the inspection team moved on. Rylan crossed out the entry for Cabin 3 and corrected the occupancy sheet to reflect the official arrival time. No incident report was filed, and the matter was set aside. Cabin 3 remained unused for the rest of the season. Rylan locked it and left the key hanging on its hook, assuming the situation resulted from fatigue or miscommunication. Still, the radio call stayed vivid in his memory. Weeks later, maintenance inspected the heater in Cabin 3 and replaced a worn internal component. The report noted a knocking noise during operation but listed no reporting party. Rylan noticed the note but did not raise the issue again. As winter ended, the inspection season closed without further problems. The occupancy sheets were archived, and the crossed-out entry blended among other routine corrections. Nothing else called attention to that night. Rylan continued working the property for several more years. Cabin 3 stood unchanged, quiet, and intact, though it was rarely opened. Over time, its absence from schedules became normal, even to Rylan. He did not know then that the cabin itself no longer existed in official records. That detail would surface much later, long after the mistake had been absorbed into routine paperwork. Years passed without further mention of the incident, and Rylan continued his seasonal work without disruption. The crossed-out entry stayed buried among other routine notes that rarely received attention. Cabin 3 remained standing, unused, and gradually faded from daily consideration. In 2020, the utility company conducted a compliance review of all remote properties. The audit focused on fuel usage, maintenance costs, and occupancy records spanning several years. Rylan was asked to assist by clarifying older handwritten logs stored in the office. When the auditors reached the winter records from 2014, they paused at the crossed-out entry for Cabin 3. There were no corresponding fuel usage increases, no access badge logs, and no recorded radio traffic assigned to that cabin for that night. Rylan explained the events again, carefully and consistently. He described the early arrival, the radio call, and the heater complaint. The auditors listened without interruption, then compared his account to system records. One auditor pointed out that Cabin 3 had been officially decommissioned the month before that winter season. A boundary update changed how the property was classified, and Cabin 3 was removed from the active inventory. The structure remained physically intact, but it no longer existed in the system. Because of that change, any radio traffic from its assigned frequency would not have been logged. Fuel usage from the cabin heater would have blended into shared infrastructure readings. No badge access was required because the cabin was no longer considered occupied space. The auditors concluded that Rylan had unknowingly checked someone into a cabin that no longer existed on paper. Habit and unchanged physical conditions overrode updated documentation. The radio call, heater issue, and maintenance note aligned with that explanation. There was no evidence confirming who stayed in the cabin, and no evidence proving no one did. The cabin had been accessible, stocked, and functional for that one night. The mistake resulted from a system change that never reached daily operations. The report closed without assigning fault. The incident was categorized as an administrative oversight with no safety impact. The recommendation stated that all decommissioned structures should be clearly marked or removed. The following summer, Cabin 3 was dismantled. The materials were hauled away, and the site was cleared to match updated property maps. New signage reflected the revised layout, and future caretakers were trained using corrected documentation. Rylan left the job not long after. He accepted the explanation, even though parts of the night still felt unusually specific in his memory. He remembered the tone of the radio call and the ordinary nature of the complaint. To him, the mistake was not dramatic. It showed how routine and familiarity could override records when changes happened quietly. One cabin functioned for a night, then vanished through correction rather than secrecy. The crossed-out entry remained the only written trace. No incident report was filed, and no follow-up occurred. Only one person remembered unlocking a door that should not have been used anymore. For everyone else, Cabin 3 had never hosted anyone that night. For Rylan, it had, even if the system refused to agree. A night guard logged this detail years too late. A single line in a security log became important long after it should have mattered. The detail sat unnoticed for years, written during a quiet night that felt routine at the time. Evan Ketter was 44 years old and worked as a night guard at a regional medical storage facility on the edge of a mid-sized town. The building stored archived equipment, sealed records, and unused medical supplies from earlier expansions. After business hours, the facility remained empty, quiet, and tightly controlled. Evan worked alone most nights and preferred the isolation. His shift involved timed patrols every hour, camera checks, and handwritten reports kept in a thick binder at the main desk. He trusted routine more than memory and believed details only mattered if they were written down clearly. On a mild spring night in 2012, Evan started his shift just before 10. He reviewed the handover notes left by the day guard and found nothing unusual listed. No late access was scheduled, and all departments officially cleared the building by 9. The first patrol passed without incident. Evan checked the loading bays, emergency exits, and refrigeration corridors, then returned to the desk to log completion. The lighting followed its timers, and the steady hum of cooling units filled the building with constant background noise. Just after midnight, Evan noticed something slightly off while reviewing the camera feeds. A light remained on in the side hallway leading to the old records wing. That hallway usually stayed dark overnight unless maintenance was scheduled. Evan walked down the corridor and reached the records wing door. It was unlocked. He paused, listening for any sound inside, then opened it slowly and stepped into the room. Long rows of metal shelving lined the space, stacked with sealed boxes labeled with dates going back decades. Nothing appeared disturbed. No carts were present, no boxes were shifted, and the dust patterns on the floor looked unchanged. Evan locked the door again and assumed a day employee forgot to secure it before leaving. He considered calling it in, but unlocked doors happened occasionally and rarely meant anything more. Evan decided to mention it in the morning notes and continued his patrol. Around 2 in the morning, Evan heard a faint sound through the ventilation system. It resembled a cart rolling briefly across a hard surface, then stopping abruptly. He stood still, counting seconds, waiting for it to repeat. The sound did not return. Evan checked the camera feed covering the record's wing entrance and nearby hallway. The footage showed the door closed and no movement detected. He marked the sound as inconclusive in his mental checklist and resumed walking. During his next round, Evan noticed something new near the base of the record's wing door. A laminated access badge lay face down against the wall, partly hidden by the baseboard's shadow. It had not been there earlier in the night. Evan picked it up and examined it under the hallway light. The badge carried no printed name, only a faded department code and a magnetic strip worn smooth from use. The design looked older than current employee badges, but still familiar. He tried the badge at a reader near the desk. It did not register. Evan placed it beside the logbook and continued his patrol, assuming someone dropped it earlier and forgot to report it missing. The remainder of the shift passed quietly. No alarms triggered, no doors opened, and no additional sounds traveled through the vents. Evan completed his final patrol just before dawn, checking the records wing one last time. The door remained locked. The hallway light was now off. Everything appeared settled. At the end of the shift, Evan logged the unlocked door and the found badge in the binder. He wrote the entries carefully, noting the time, location, and appearance of the badge. He placed it in the lost property drawer and closed the log. Morning staff arrived shortly after, and the building returned to normal operation. No one asked about the badge, and Evan did not follow up further. At the time, the details seemed minor and safely documented. Years later, that single line in the log would be read again under different circumstances. By then, the moment it described had already passed beyond correction. Time moved forward without drawing attention to the entry Evan wrote that night. Weeks passed, then months, and the medical storage facility continued operating without incident. The binder filled with new pages and older logs were archived into storage cabinets. Evan remained on the night shift and followed the same routines. He noticed no missing inventory, no unusual access requests, and no complaints tied to the records wing. The lost badge stayed in the drawer for several weeks before being boxed with other unclaimed items. During that period, no department reported a missing access badge matching the description Evan logged. Human Resources ran routine audits, and nothing flagged the entry as requiring follow-up. The unlocked door note blended into dozens of similar minor issues. Over the next few years, the facility underwent gradual changes. Departments relocated, storage layouts shifted, and digital systems replaced handwritten access tracking. Evan adapted slowly, continuing to rely on his logs even as procedures evolved. By 2016, the old records wing was officially sealed. Its contents were either digitized or transferred to off-site storage. The hallway leading to it was closed to staff and marked as restricted access. Evan remembered the unlocked door from years earlier when he saw maintenance crews install a permanent barrier. He briefly mentioned it to a supervisor, who dismissed it as unrelated to current operations. The moment passed without discussion. In 2018, the facility faced an internal review following discrepancies found during a compliance check. Investigators reviewed access histories, archived footage, and legacy logs dating back several years. Evan was asked to assist due to his long tenure. He provided his old binders without hesitation. The logs were scanned and indexed, including the entry about the unlocked records wing and the found badge. At the time, Evan did not realize that line would receive special attention. Weeks later, an investigator approached Evan with questions about the badge. They asked where it was found and whether it was ever claimed. Evan repeated what he had written years earlier and explained why he logged it as minor. The investigator explained that the badge code did not match any department active during 2012. According to archived records, the code belonged to a unit dissolved several years earlier before the date of Evan's entry. That detail unsettled Evan. He reviewed the scanned log again and saw his handwriting clearly dated. There was no mistake about the night. The badge style and code should not have existed within active circulation. Investigators continued reviewing access data from that period. They found no authorized entries to the records wing after 9 that evening. Camera footage had long since been overwritten, leaving no visual confirmation. Evan realized the badge and the unlocked door were now being viewed together rather than separately. What once seemed like routine oversights now formed a pattern that no one noticed at the time. Still, the investigation did not reach a conclusion. Without footage or corroborating access logs, the matter remained unresolved. Evan was told to wait while further archival checks were conducted. The binder was returned to storage, and Evan resumed his night shifts. He felt uneasy in a way he had not before. For the first time, he wondered whether writing the detail had happened too late to matter. The investigation concluded months later with findings that arrived quietly rather than dramatically. Evan was called into a small office and asked to review a summary prepared from archived materials and interviews. According to the review, the department code on the badge belonged to a temporary records relocation unit active during a short transition period. That unit operated briefly in 2008, then dissolved after its work was completed. Its access badges were supposed to be collected and destroyed. During that transition, several sealed boxes from the records wing were moved overnight by a contracted crew. Dispatch notes from that period mentioned delayed inventory reconciliation due to staff turnover. No follow-up audit occurred after the unit dissolved. Investigators concluded that an old badge had likely remained in circulation unnoticed for years. The unlocked door and the sound Evan heard could have been related to an unauthorized but routine access by someone who believed the badge was still valid. What troubled them was the timing. According to inventory timestamps, one sealed container from the records wing was last scanned shortly after midnight on the same night Evan logged the badge. The container was never logged at its destination. The container contents were listed as outdated administrative records with no clinical data. The loss was classified as non-critical and written off during a later system migration. No one connected the loss to Evan's log entry at the time. Evan realized then that the detail he recorded had been accurate but insufficient. By the time systems flagged the missing container years later, any immediate investigation window had long closed. The report stated that earlier correlation might have clarified the discrepancy. It also noted that routine logs were rarely reviewed unless prompted by an incident. Evan's entry had remained dormant until years passed. No disciplinary action followed. The incident was classified as a documentation gap compounded by delayed review. Recommendations focused on improving log audits and badge retirement procedures. The records wing remained sealed. The lost container was never recovered and no further evidence emerged. The facility continued operating without public notice of the discrepancy. Evan returned to his night shift with a changed perspective. He continued logging details carefully, but he understood now that timing mattered as much as accuracy. The line he wrote that night had been correct, yet it arrived years too late to change anything. The building stayed quiet, the binder kept filling, and the moment passed into administrative history. For Evan, the night remained clear in memory. A light left on, a door unlocked, a badge on the floor. The system moved forward, but that detail waited, unnoticed, until it no longer mattered. An unheard voicemail surfaced after the building closed. A voicemail was recorded on a night that appeared ordinary in every measurable way. It contained nothing that triggered an alarm, nothing that interrupted routine, and nothing that demanded attention at the time. The message remained unheard, stored quietly in a system designed to remember even when people did not. Marcus Hale was 47 years old and had worked as a night supervisor for the Municipal Records Office for nearly 13 years. The building handled permits, archived correspondence, and decades of public documentation. During the day, it was crowded and noisy. At night, it felt hollow, reduced to lights, timers, and mechanical sounds. Marcus preferred the late shift. His work followed a strict checklist that rarely changed. He locked offices, monitored the alarm panel, reviewed camera feeds, and checked the voicemail system used for after-hours calls. He believed consistency prevented mistakes, and he trusted systems that behaved the same way every night. In early autumn of 2013, Marcus arrived just after 7 in the evening. The sky was already dark, and the lobby lights reflected against the glass entrance. He signed in, placed his jacket on the back of the chair, and reviewed the handover notes left by the day staff. No late meetings were scheduled, no maintenance crews were expected. The building was cleared by 6, as it had been for years. By 8 o'clock, the building settled into its nighttime state. Hallway lights dimmed automatically, motion sensors armed themselves, and the heating system cycled with a low, steady hum. Marcus completed his first patrol, checking locked offices, stairwells, and emergency exits. When he returned to the security desk, he performed his first voicemail check. The system displayed no missed calls. The indicator light was dark. Marcus logged the check and moved on. Most nights, the voicemail system received nothing. Occasionally, a caller left a wrong number message or an automated reminder. Marcus listened to them, documented them, and deleted them before morning. Around 9:30, a faint noise echoed through the stairwell. It sounded like a door shifting or a handrail vibrating briefly. Marcus paused, waited, then continued. Older buildings made sounds that carried unpredictably. At 10:48, one exterior door sensor briefly flickered on the alarm panel, then returned to green. Marcus checked the corresponding camera feed. The image showed the sidewalk outside, empty except for a passing reflection from a car's headlights. He logged the event as a false trigger. Shortly after 11, Marcus returned to the desk and began reviewing paperwork. The camera feeds cycled slowly across the monitors. The voicemail console remained unchanged. At 11:12, the after-hours phone line received a call. The system answered automatically after 4 rings and began recording. Due to the age of the interface, the visual indicator failed to activate immediately. This delay was documented in technical notes, but rarely encountered in practice. The voicemail recorded for just under a minute. No alert sounded, no light illuminated. Marcus remained unaware. He left the desk for another patrol at 11:20, checking file rooms, restrooms, and the rear corridor. When he returned, the voicemail indicator was still dark. Just before midnight, Marcus checked the voicemail system again. The menu displayed no new messages. He logged the check without hesitation. The remainder of the night passed quietly. No alarms triggered, no doors opened. The building stayed still. Before dawn, Marcus completed his final patrol and returned to the desk. He performed one last voicemail check, confirming once again that no new messages were listed. Satisfied, he completed his log and prepared to leave. 2 weeks later, the municipal office permanently closed. Operations moved to a newer facility, and the old building entered decommissioning. Phones, servers, and recording systems were disconnected and boxed for storage. Marcus assisted briefly but did not review archived voicemail files. There was no reason to believe anything had been recorded. The building lights were turned off, the doors locked, and access revoked. At that moment, the voicemail still existed. It had been recorded correctly, stored properly, and overlooked completely. No one had listened to it. No one knew it was there. After the municipal records office closed, the building did not immediately disappear from use. For several months, it remained locked but powered down only partially, awaiting final clearance. Eventually, its systems were shut off, documented, and prepared for long-term storage. Phones, servers, and data recording units were cataloged and transferred to a climate-controlled warehouse operated by the city's Information Services Department. The voicemail system from the building was included as part of a bulk archive. According to the checklist, it contained no stored messages. The equipment was sealed in labeled containers and placed on metal shelving alongside hundreds of other retired systems from across the city. No one revisited it. There was no operational reason to. Marcus Hale transferred to the new municipal building and continued working nights for another year. The old records office became something he referenced only when asked about legacy procedures. Eventually, even those questions stopped. Years passed. In 2019, the city initiated a long-delayed digitization project aimed at reducing physical storage. Part of the project required technicians to inspect and verify the contents of legacy systems before disposal or permanent archiving. Claire Donovan, an IT technician with experience in outdated phone systems, was assigned to review several voicemail servers from decommissioned buildings. Most were empty or contained routine test recordings from installation dates. When Claire powered on the voicemail unit from the old records office, she noticed something immediately inconsistent. The system indicated one stored message. According to its paperwork, it should have been cleared before storage. She accessed the internal menu and confirmed that a single voicemail was present. It was marked as unreviewed and had never been played. The timestamp placed it late at night, approximately 2 weeks before the building's closure. Claire checked the export logs and found no record of the message being transferred or deleted. That suggested the voicemail had been recorded correctly but missed during routine checks. Following protocol, Claire paused her work and documented the anomaly. She flagged the unit and informed her supervisor, who instructed her not to access the message yet. The recording was preserved and copied to a secure digital format. The next step involved cross-referencing the voicemail timestamp with archived building records. Security logs were retrieved and scanned. The night supervisor listed on duty during the recording was Marcus Hale. Marcus was contacted and asked to review the scanned logs from that period. He recognized his own handwriting immediately. His entry for that night clearly stated that no voicemail messages were present during his checks. He explained the routine he followed and mentioned the occasional delay with the indicator light, though he had rarely encountered it. He had checked the system multiple times that night and again before leaving. The investigators noted that the voicemail system's software version had a documented flaw involving delayed indexing of new messages. Under specific conditions, a recording could fail to appear in the message list until the system was refreshed. That explanation accounted for the technical failure, but not the timing. The call had been placed during a period when the building was officially closed and nearly empty. No exterior door access logs showed authorized entry during that window. Camera footage from that night no longer existed. The voicemail, preserved but unheard, now represented the only remaining trace of activity from that moment. Because of policy constraints, the message was not played immediately. Approval was required to determine whether it contained sensitive or legally relevant information. By the time authorization was granted, the building had been closed for years. Whatever the voicemail referred to, it belonged to a context that no longer existed. The message remained sealed, its significance growing only because it had been found too late. Approval to access the voicemail came through quietly, without urgency. By the time it did, the message had already existed for more than 6 years, preserved in storage and referenced only by timestamps and case numbers. Claire Donovan was present when the file was finally opened. An internal compliance officer and a records supervisor listened alongside her. No one expected anything dramatic. The assumption was that the voicemail would be incomplete, accidental, or irrelevant. The recording began with several seconds of background noise. The sound quality was poor, consistent with an older phone system. A low hum filled the line, followed by a voice that spoke carefully, as if unsure whether anyone was listening. The caller identified the building by name. They mentioned being inside and not finding anyone at the desk. The tone was calm but strained, controlled in a way that suggested effort. The caller stated that a door had locked behind them and that they had been waiting for some time. They said they did not want to trigger an alarm and assumed someone would return shortly. The message ended without a request for a callback, only a statement that they would try again later. The voicemail stopped. No sounds of distress followed. No abrupt ending, just silence. The room remained quiet after the playback finished. The compliance officer replayed the message once more, confirming the timestamp. It aligned exactly with the period Marcus Hale had been on duty. Records were reviewed again. No interior alarms had been triggered that night, no emergency calls were placed from the building, no incident reports existed. Investigators concluded that the caller likely exited the building on their own or contacted someone through another means. There was no evidence of harm, and no missing person report from that period matched the limited information in the voicemail. Still, the message raised uncomfortable questions. How someone entered the building was unclear. Why they did not approach security directly was unexplained. And why the voicemail went unheard remained a technical failure layered on routine. The case was closed as informational. No further action was taken. Marcus was informed of the voicemail's contents weeks later. He listened once, then declined to hear it again. He accepted the explanation, but found little comfort in it. He returned to his routines, continuing to log details carefully, aware now that accuracy without timing could still fail. The old building was eventually demolished. Its records were digitized, its systems recycled, and its physical presence erased. The voicemail remained archived, labeled, and indexed, no longer unheard, but permanently late. It stood as a record not of what happened, but of what almost mattered, and the narrow window in which listening might have changed something. The bridge locals avoided, but never explained why. A single bridge spanned the quiet river outside the town, yet locals rarely crossed it after sunset. No official warning existed, but everyone knew to stay away, and no one offered a reason that made sense. The bridge had stood for decades, weathered by storms and time, yet something about it unsettled anyone who approached it at night. Harold Jensen was 38 years old and worked as a night security patrol for the County Parks Department. His route covered trails, parking lots, and small facilities along the river. He knew every crossing, every light post, and every railing. Yet the bridge locals called the Old Bridge always felt different. It carried an atmosphere that was difficult to describe, a heaviness in the air that was noticeable even from the distance. On a cool autumn night in 2015, Harold started his patrol shortly after 9. Fog rolled over the river, curling along the surface and drifting into the low branches of trees lining the banks. Streetlights from the nearby town cast pale reflections on the water. The wind made a low whistle through the trees, carrying a chill that cut through his jacket. He drove slowly along the road, parallel to the river, checking each crossing as he passed. When he reached the old bridge, he slowed further. Structurally, it looked ordinary. Steel beams, aged planks, and a faded railing. There were no warning signs. Still, instinct told him to be cautious. The bridge seemed to belong to another layer of time, almost alive in its stillness. Locals called it a void after dark quietly, and Harold had heard the warnings, though no one ever explained why. Some said accidents happened. Others claimed they heard voices or footsteps. None of it had been documented officially. To most, it was just superstition. But Harold had worked these roads long enough to notice patterns that didn't fit simple explanations. He parked a few yards away and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The fog thickened, muffling his steps. The river below moved slowly, but in the mist, it looked deeper, darker. Halfway across, he paused. The wood of the planks creaked under his weight. One section near the center sagged slightly, more than natural wear should allow. Harold's light caught faint scratches along the railing. They were recent, irregular, but deliberate. They didn't form letters or symbols, yet they felt intentional. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. A bird's distant call sounded out of place, echoing across the foggy water. He continued across carefully, keeping his gaze on the planks. The wind rattled the beams above, and a low groaning sound came from the supports. Harold had walked this bridge hundreds of times during the day and early evening. Tonight, it was different. He felt an unease that was more physical than mental, a weight pressing down, urging him to move faster. When he reached the far side, he looked back. The road behind him was empty. The fog swirled thickly, obscuring details, leaving only the outline of the bridge and the reflective glint of metal beams. No cars, no animals, no other humans. Only the river moving silently below. Harold stepped off the bridge and kept walking along the riverbank, flashlight sweeping the structure from a distance. He noted the sagging planks, the scratches, the fog clinging unnaturally to the surface. No one crossed that night. No footprints other than his own. By the time he returned to his vehicle, he had made mental notes of everything. The way the mist seemed heavier on the bridge than the surrounding area, the subtle sounds carried across the water, and the eerie silence that replaced normal night noises. Nothing in the official records mentioned these details. Harold finished his patrol and logged the route in the report. In his entry, he noted the bridge appeared ordinary but unnerving. The local avoidance made sense instinctively, even if no one would ever explain why. He left the site as fog drifted away, leaving the bridge in shadow. Its silence felt deeper than the river, heavier than the night itself. Harold could not articulate why, but the feeling lingered long after he drove back toward town. The old bridge had whispered something only a few ever noticed, and for Harold, that whisper stayed with him. Weeks passed after Harold's first night at the old bridge, but the sense of unease lingered. Locals continued to avoid it, crossing it only if absolutely necessary, and even then in daylight. Drivers slowed as they passed, joggers rerouted their paths, and maintenance crews hesitated to work there after dusk. Nobody ever explained why, and nobody officially documented incidents. One October night in 2015, Harold returned for a routine patrol. A thin fog rolled across the river, thickening in patches along the banks. The air felt heavier than usual, and the quiet of the night was punctuated only by the distant hum of a streetlight and the occasional rustle of tree branches. He drove slowly along the road leading to the bridge, keeping his eyes on the water and the low fog that obscured the far side. As he approached, his headlights revealed subtle changes from his previous visit. Scratches had appeared along the wooden railing, irregular and deeper than before. The sag in the center planks seemed slightly more pronounced, as if weight had been applied in the dark. No camera recorded any traffic or pedestrian activity, yet the physical evidence suggested something had crossed recently. Harold parked a few yards away and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The wind carried a low groaning from the steel supports, and the fog wrapped around the bridge like a living thing. He could almost feel it moving with him as he advanced. Each plank creaked underfoot, and the beam of his flashlight caught glints of moisture along the scratched metal railings. The bridge appeared empty, yet it demanded attention in a way no official report could justify. Halfway across, Harold paused. A faint pattern of depressions on the planks suggested footsteps that were not his own, not matching his shoe size or stride. He shone the flashlight back and forth. Shadows pooled at the edges, shifting as if the fog itself moved unnaturally. The river below flowed silently, reflecting dim light, yet it seemed heavier, darker than before. The bridge exuded a presence, subtle but undeniable. Harold moved forward cautiously. The deeper scratches on the wood suggested someone or something had applied pressure deliberately. A small, almost imperceptible vibration ran along the planks, synchronized with his heartbeat rather than any natural rhythm. He stopped and listened. Only wind and distant traffic on the main road answered. Yet the sensation of being observed remained. Upon reaching the far side, Harold looked back. The bridge now seemed longer, darker, with shadows that stretched unnaturally into the fog. He stepped off the structure, keeping his flashlight trained on it from a distance. New scratches caught the light, fresh and deliberate. No footprints, no tire marks, no signs of passage other than the marks themselves. Over the following nights, Harold returned multiple times. Each visit revealed slight but consistent differences. A new scratch here, a deeper plank depression there, subtle shifts in the fog's movement that he could not explain. Cameras covering the bridge showed no movement. Logs indicated no authorized access. The evidence mounted silently, almost imperceptibly. Conversations with locals confirmed what Harold suspected. Drivers spoke of strange reflections on the water, joggers mentioned the sensation of being watched, and maintenance crews quietly admitted they avoided late work on the bridge. Yet when Harold asked for details, answers were vague. Best to stay away, they said. No one documented incidents officially. Harold began keeping his own detailed log. He measured plank positions, mapped scratches, and noted environmental conditions, wind speed, fog density, and temperature. Nothing indicated immediate danger, but the subtle anomalies persisted. The bridge, he realized, operated under its own set of rules, invisible to authorities and unnoticed by casual observers. By the end of October, the bridge had transformed in Harold's mind from a simple crossing to a point of tension. Each patrol became an exercise in careful observation. Every creak, shadow, and ripple was documented, each anomaly compared to previous nights. The locals' instinctive avoidance made sense now, even if no official explanation existed. Harold continued nightly patrols with a quiet vigilance, aware that the bridge held secrets no one would admit to. Its presence was heavy, almost sentient in its quiet insistence. The river flowed, the fog shifted, and the scratches persisted each night, confirming that some mysteries were meant to be observed, but never fully explained. Harold continued his patrols into late November. Each night, the bridge remained empty, yet the anomalies persisted. New scratches appeared along the railing. Faint depressions in the planks shifted subtly, and the fog behaved in ways he could not explain. The locals' instinctive avoidance now made sense to him, even if no one would ever articulate the reason. One night, he arrived earlier than usual and watched the bridge from a distance. The fog lay thick across the river, and the wooden planks reflected dim light from his flashlight. For a long moment, the bridge seemed to breathe, as if acknowledging his presence. No sound, no movement, only a subtle tension that pressed in from all sides. Harold documented everything in his personal log, noting each anomaly, every scratch, each uneven plank, and the peculiar patterns of the fog and wind. The bridge did not follow conventional rules. Cameras captured nothing, alarms recorded nothing, and official reports listed only routine inspections. Yet Harold knew the bridge held secrets older than any of his notes. By December, the bridge had become more than a crossing. It was a threshold between the ordinary and something unquantifiable. Even when the river flowed quietly below and the night seemed empty, the bridge exerted an influence that could not be measured. The locals' warnings, though, never explained, carried weight that Harold now understood instinctively. One final night, Harold stopped mid-crossing and looked toward the far side. The fog shifted unnaturally, curling like smoke along the planks. He felt a presence, not malicious, but aware. He stepped off the bridge slowly, leaving it to its silence. Behind him, the scratches remained, the planks sagged, and the fog lingered. Nothing in the official world would ever acknowledge it, and perhaps that was exactly as the bridge intended. Harold left the site, recording the bridge in his log one last time before the end of the patrol season. Its mystery remained intact. Locals continued to avoid it, and the reasons remained unspoken. The bridge stood quietly over the river, indifferent to human observation, preserving its secrets for anyone daring enough to notice, but never explainable. For Harold, the bridge was a reminder that some things in the world exist beyond reports, beyond explanations, and beyond reason. Some mysteries demand respect through avoidance, not understanding. And in that quiet, fog-draped night, the bridge kept its truth hidden, as it had for generations. A ranger station hid one final recording. The ranger station sat on the fringe of the forest, isolated and small, its weathered wood and metal roof blending into the shadows of the towering trees. For years, locals and hikers alike had whispered about it quietly, noting its presence without offering explanations. Some avoided it entirely after sunset. There was a sense that the station contained something unspoken, a detail not recorded in reports or public records, something that lingered in the air around the building. Lucas Merrow, 42, worked night shifts at the station during the late summer months. His responsibilities were precise: monitoring remote forest cameras, checking fire alarms, and maintaining a daily log of ranger and wildlife activity. The station contained a small server room, radios for communication, and an older voicemail system that recorded after-hours calls from field rangers. Lucas had used the system countless times, and it had rarely produced anything unusual. On a late August night in 2016, Lucas arrived just after 10. The air was humid and carried the earthy scent of the forest floor. A faint wind rustled leaves in the distant trees, and the call of an owl echoed across the clearing. He completed a quick patrol of the perimeter, checking the gates and the observation tower before returning to the station. The night seemed ordinary, almost too quiet, but Lucas felt a subtle tension in the air that he couldn't place. Inside, the station hummed with life. Computers blinked, radios emitted low static, and the voicemail system sat dormant on the desk. Most nights, it recorded nothing. Messages typically came from automated alerts, sensor malfunctions, or field rangers leaving routine check-ins. Lucas performed a standard check around 11:15. The system appeared normal. No new messages, no missed calls. He tapped through the interface, scrolling past old recordings he had already reviewed, and logged the check in his nightly binder. Shortly after midnight, a faint flicker appeared on the small server monitor. Lucas stepped closer, expecting a system alert or maintenance ping. Instead, the screen displayed a single new voicemail entry he had never noticed before. The label read "Final," accompanied by a timestamp late the previous night. Lucas froze briefly. He had checked the system multiple times, yet this message had appeared now, as if it had waited to reveal itself. He pressed play, but the interface hesitated, the indicator light blinking sporadically, almost reluctant to activate. Lucas set down his flashlight and tried again. The recording began with static, a low crackle that filled the small room. Then a voice spoke, calm but deliberate, identifying itself as a ranger in the field near a portion of the forest no longer open to the public. The speaker mentioned something unusual, something they had observed but could not verify. The message ended abruptly, under a minute, with no instructions, no names, and no indication of urgency. Lucas replayed it once more. The timestamp corresponded to a time when no ranger had reported activity and no alarms had been triggered. The system's older design meant that sometimes recordings could fail to display immediately, but Lucas had never seen one labeled final. 2024 with jocks possible. A subtle tension filled the station. The hum of computers and the faint wind outside suddenly seemed louder, more deliberate. Lucas made a note in his personal log, describing the recording, the timestamp, and the peculiar label. He left the entry intentionally vague, unsure if anyone would ever need to review it. The forest outside remained still, the wind brushing gently against the trees, carrying the faint sound of distant wildlife. Hours later, Lucas finished his patrol. He double-checked the doors, verified the alarm system, and logged the night as routine except for the final recording. It existed, stored and unnoticed for months or perhaps years, waiting to be acknowledged. He turned off lights, left the station, and drove along the narrow forest road back toward town. For the rest of the summer, Lucas could not shake the memory of the recording. Its presence was subtle yet unmistakable. The station seemed heavier that night, charged with the knowledge of something left behind, something unspoken. The final recording existed, unseen and unheard, a secret quietly preserved in the digital shadows of the ranger station. The forest carried on as it always had, oblivious to human awareness. Yet the station, its servers, and that single, mysterious recording remained, quietly marking the night as one that would be remembered only when the system and the message would finally demand attention. After that night, the ranger station returned to its usual rhythm, but the final recording weighed on Lucas's mind. He continued his patrols with meticulous attention, logging wildlife activity, checking cameras, and monitoring fire alarms. Yet, he could not stop thinking about the voicemail. Something about the label "final" suggested importance beyond routine, though no one had confirmed its meaning. Days passed. The forest remained quiet, almost unnaturally so. Birds and nocturnal animals moved through the underbrush, but the usual sounds, branches snapping under small animals, distant hoots, the rustle of wind in the treetops, seemed muted. Lucas noticed small anomalies. A faint shift in the fog along the forest floor, lights from his tower flickering in irregular patterns, and radios occasionally emitting low static at unexpected intervals. Lucas began keeping a more detailed personal log. He recorded times, environmental conditions, unusual sounds, and the state of doors and windows. Each night, he walked the perimeter twice instead of once, scanning the forest with a flashlight and listening carefully for any movement. Every creak of the station's floorboards, every groan of the aged beams became notable. One night, a week after the initial discovery, Lucas noticed the voicemail system's indicator light blinking unexpectedly. He approached cautiously. The screen displayed a brief message count increase, though no new timestamp appeared. He pressed play, and only static emerged. A low, mechanical hum filled the station, resonating unnaturally through the walls. Lucas stepped back, unease creeping up his spine. The system should not have recorded anything further. Another night, while checking the observation tower, Lucas glimpsed a shadow moving along the forest edge near a closed trail. The movement was deliberate, smooth, yet too indistinct to identify. No cameras captured it, and by the time he descended, the shadow had vanished. His logs noted only the time and general location, proof of nothing, yet proof of something he could not explain. As the weeks continued, the forest itself seemed to react to his presence. Fog rolled heavier across the trees than usual. Sounds of distant wildlife appeared delayed or muffled. Lucas could not determine whether the anomalies were environmental, mechanical, or something else entirely. The final recording had shifted his perception of the station, making him hyper-aware of details previously ignored. Staff rotations occasionally brought other rangers to the station. They noticed nothing out of the ordinary, dismissing minor anomalies as quirks of the old building or the forest. Lucas, however, continued his night logs meticulously, documenting subtle irregularities, flickering lights, displaced equipment, small scratches on the desk, even the sensation of being watched in empty rooms. By the end of the month, the station itself felt alive in ways he could not rationalize. The final recording, though unheard in its entirety, had established a new baseline of attention. Every noise, shadow, or change in temperature became significant, each anomaly compared against his notes from previous nights. Through these weeks, Lucas learned that the station held secrets beyond the capabilities of its equipment or personnel. The voicemail, simple in function yet enigmatic in appearance, had altered the perception of the space. Something unseen had begun to assert its presence, subtle yet unmistakable. Each patrol, each observation confirmed the same truth. The forest and the ranger station were no longer ordinary. The final recording, waiting in the voicemail system, remained a silent marker of events beyond explanation, a tether to something hidden that would not be revealed until its time came. Weeks later, after the station had settled into its usual rhythm and Lucas continued his nightly patrols, the final recording was finally authorized for playback. The city's forest management office required verification before any sensitive information could be accessed. Lucas sat alone in the small station office as the system began streaming the audio. The static was thick at first, but then a voice emerged, low, calm, precise. The speaker identified themselves as a field ranger near a remote section of the forest, an area long restricted to public access. The voice described seeing something unusual: shadows that moved independently of the trees, shapes that seemed to pause midair before vanishing, and sounds that had no source. The speaker reported their observations carefully, avoiding speculation, emphasizing that no alarms had triggered and that no other rangers were nearby. The message ended abruptly. No one returned calls, no follow-up instructions were recorded, and the final word simply stated that the caller would monitor and report later. The recording's brevity left more questions than answers, yet its presence confirmed that the forest had concealed events long unseen. Lucas replayed the message once more, noting the timestamp. It aligned perfectly with the nights he had observed subtle anomalies: flickering lights, shadows along the edge of the forest, unexplained noises inside the station. The final recording had existed as a silent witness to events that nobody else would have confirmed. The station remained quiet afterward, yet its atmosphere felt altered. Lucas realized that he had been observing the forest through a lens shaped by a message recorded but unheard for years. The voice in the recording had anchored his observations, giving context to subtle irregularities that would otherwise have been dismissed. No immediate action followed. The Forest Management Office filed the recording as informational, noting its unusual nature but recognizing that verification was impossible. The station's logs remained intact and the nightly patrols continued. For Lucas, the final recording represented a tether between what was seen, what was reported, and what had been hidden in plain sight. The forest and the station held their secrets, preserved across years, waiting for someone to notice. As he stepped outside that night, the trees swayed gently in the wind, shadows pooling along the perimeter. The station remained still, the voicemail system silent. The final recording had been heard, yet it offered no closure, only a quiet acknowledgement that some events were meant to exist beyond explanation, observed but never fully understood. The forest carried on, indifferent to human presence, and the ranger station kept its final secret: a single message marking the intersection of vigilance, curiosity, and the unknown. Lucas left for the night, aware that some mysteries were preserved not to be solved, but to remind him of the quiet power of what lies hidden.